All right. Well, again, everyone, thank you for joining. Thrilled to have the opportunity to share some of these ideas with you, hear your questions, and engage in a dialogue. I should say, just by way of background, part of the reason that I'm in the field to begin with is I took the very first positive psychology course at Harvard when I was an undergrad, back when Tal Ben-Shahar had about 18 students in a seminar. And it just fundamentally changed the way that I saw the world. And I knew, excuse me, at that moment that I wanted to become a psychologist and that I wanted to take all of the knowledge that was being gathered and try to apply it to the world of work and organization. And that really brings me to the beginning of this idea behind give and take, which is about 10 years ago, I started studying and working with organizations. And I was just struck by how many people were paranoid, who constantly believed that somebody else was out to get them or might stab them in the back if they weren't careful. And my goals in my research program was to try to figure out, could we create the opposite of paranoia in organizations? And lo and behold, it turns out there's actually a great word to describe the opposite of paranoia, called pronoia. And for those of you who have ever felt pronoid, you'll know it as, I'm going to borrow a description from the psychologist Brian Little. He says, pronoia is the irrepressible fear that other people are plotting your well-being. I think it's a great concept. If you're pronoid, you may actually have this delusion that other people are going around saying nice things about you behind your back. And I think that part of what I want to do today is actually try to make sense of where does pronoia come from? Why do some people carry around this delusional belief that other people are plotting their well-being? So the place to begin is to say, I'm really interested in the question of success, and in particular, how you can own a face that looks like this. And when we look at success, most research tends to assume that there are three major drivers of who achieves great results in organizations: hard work, talent, and luck. So you're all familiar with grit. You're all familiar with deliberate practice. Many of you have read Outliers and know the importance of being in the right place at the right time. And what's missing from that picture for me, really, is a look at the social forces that drive success, not just the individual factors. And so what I've been looking at for the past decade is, what are the interaction styles that people bring to the workplace? And can we define them and understand their impact on success? So there's a humorist, Robert Benchley, who said once that there are only two kinds of people in the world: those who divide the world into two kinds of people and those who don't. I always thought that was a poignant description of how hard it is to capture the human condition with only two categories. And after I came across that quote, I made a commitment that I would never oversimplify the richness and the complexity of human nature by using two categories to describe people, which is why today I'm proud to bring you to three categories. It turns out that there are actually three fundamental styles of interaction that people bring to their professional relationships. And I call these reciprocity styles, but you could also just think about them as different motives behind give and take. So on one end of the reciprocity spectrum, we have people that I call the takers. They tend to be very self-serving. They typically are looking to get as much as possible from other people and minimize what they have to contribute in return. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the givers, people who actually, strangely, enjoy contributing more to others than they receive in return, and often will do things like make introductions, provide mentoring, share knowledge with no strings attached. Now, it's pretty rare for anybody to be a pure giver or a pure taker. You can think about these as mindsets, and we all carry a mix of them, but most of us spend most of our time at work operating right in the middle of that give and take spectrum. And I would use the term matcher to describe us. So a matcher is basically somebody who walks around trying to maintain an even balance of give and take. So if I help you, I expect you to help me. I maintain quid pro quo and fairness and really direct and strict reciprocity. And I think that these three styles are fascinating. And when I look at the styles, what I try to figure out is, how do you treat most of the people most of the time? Are you trying to really claim value from them? Are you trying to contribute value, or are you trying to trade or exchange value evenly? So these styles actually are pretty robust in the sense that you can find them in every industry. You can find them in every culture around the world, according to Alan Fisk's research. And so the question that I pose, first of all, is which of these three groups is most likely to sink to the bottom when you look at success metrics? And I decided to do this in a couple of different contexts, pulling together my studies and studies by colleagues. So let's start with one of my favorite settings, engineers. So Frank Flynn at Stanford did this wonderful study where he got groups of engineers to rate each other on how many favors they gave and how many they received. And then he tracked their productivity and their work quality. So how much did you get done and how many errors did you make over the period of several months? And he found that the engineers who were the absolute worst at both productivity and quality were the givers, i.e. the engineers who had done more favors for others than they had received in return. And they managed to put other people first so much that they sacrificed their own time and energy to get their work done efficiently and effectively. Now, let's go to a different world where you could see a pattern like this, which is medical school. There's a study that Philip Levens and his colleagues ran of every medical student in Belgium over a 7-year period. And they actually, at the very beginning of medical school, they got all the students to fill out a survey that measured the extent to which they endorsed giving, with statements like, "I love to help others." Then they tracked the grades that the medical students got in their first year, and they actually found that the more strongly you agreed with statements like, "I'd love to help others," the worse your grades were. So, one frightening implication of this is you want your doctor to be someone who has no interest in helping others whatsoever, if you take these data seriously. And then just to add insult to injury, one more context. Think about salespeople. Dane Bardens and I ran a study of salespeople where we conducted a survey. We got them to agree with statements about whether they were givers, takers, or matchers. And then we tracked their revenue over an entire year. And we found that, again, the salespeople with the worst results, the lowest annual revenue, were the givers, who were so busy trying to help their customers that they didn't actually want to sell their products to them. So I think that this paints a pretty bleak picture of success for those of you who hold giver values or really espouse giver principles. And I then wanted to turn my attention to the other end of the scale and say, okay, so if givers are at the bottom, who's most likely to be at the top? And a lot of people, especially at Wharton, immediately say the takers, because that's the most direct and immediate path to achieving success. But then, people think about it a little more carefully, and they say, no, the takers burn bridges, and they have trouble succeeding in a collaborative, interdependent world. So it's probably the matchers, who build much better relationships than takers. They gain more respect and trust. But they don't overextend themselves like givers. They don't burn out. They don't become pushovers and doormats. And that seems like a really compelling prediction, but it turns out to be wrong. I was very surprised to discover in all three of these contexts, it's the givers again who are most likely to be at the top. So if you go to that study by Frank Flynn of engineers, it turns out that the engineers with the highest productivity and the highest work quality were also givers, who did far more favors than they received in return. The takers and the matchers were more likely to fall in the middle when Flynn looked at productivity and error rates. In medical school, similar pattern. The people with the best grades, not just in year one, now over 7 years in medical school, were those who most strongly endorsed statements like, "I'd love to help others." And in my study of salespeople, if you look at the top salespeople in this particular company, the best producing salespeople were also the highest givers. In fact, if you were to switch all of the salespeople from takers to matchers, annual revenue in this company with 120 salespeople would spike from about $11 million to over $15 million a year, which was pretty neat. So for me, this really posed a paradox. Number one, why are givers overrepresented at both the bottom and the top of these different success metrics? And you can track this across lots of metrics, not just work quantity and quality, not just revenue, but also promotion rates and respect and awards from colleagues. Number two, what do the givers at the top do that takers and matchers might be interested in learning? And number three, what causes some givers to fall to the bottom? And how do you protect yourself if you are one of those givers at risk? So that's what I thought I would give you a little bit of insight into today. What I'm going to do is give you a little bit of a preview of what ended up being chapters 1 and 2 and maybe a touch of 7 and 6 over the next couple minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. So I want to do this by introducing you to my very favorite giver who I met in the research for the book. And this is somebody who was actually named in 2011 Fortune's Best Networker. And the way that Fortune did this was they actually got LinkedIn to give them access to their entire database, over 90 million people as of 2011 on LinkedIn. Fortune cross-referenced LinkedIn's networks with their list of the most powerful people in the world. So the Fortune 500 CEOs, Fortune's top 50 women in business, Fortune's top 40 in tech, and so on. 640 powerful people in total. Then what they did was they wanted to know who on LinkedIn has more connections to those powerful people than anyone else. And the winner had over 3,000 LinkedIn connections, including the founders of every successful tech company of the past 20 years. Founders of Twitter, Facebook, Foursquare, Napster, Netscape, Half.com, Flickr, the list goes on and on. The winner also had the former chef of the Grateful Dead in his or her network. I don't know why you want that person in your network, but that is a neat fact. So the question is, who is it that has that network? And you can look at the top 3 in the Fortune analysis. You will find in 3rd place this man, Michael Dell. Seems reasonable that he would know a lot of powerful people in tech. In 2nd place, Jeff Weiner, the current CEO of LinkedIn, who I will say has an unfair advantage in connecting to anyone he wants on LinkedIn. But the winner really stunned me. And those of you who are following the image, I will show you the picture. The winner is this guy. It's not the cat, it's the guy. His name is Adam Rifkin. And Adam is not as well known as anybody else who made the top list. And yet he's connected to all these high-tech founders. And I was really curious about how did he build his network? And can we learn something about reciprocity styles from that? Is he a giver, a taker, or a matcher? So I did what's only natural in this connected world that we all live in. I started stalking him online. First, I Googled him. I read everything I could find about him. Then I went on to LinkedIn and searched for common connections. I was able to find one who introduced us. And in characteristic fashion, Adam responded the same day and said, I'd love to chat tomorrow. We set up a call. Then I flew out to Northern California to watch him in action. And over many months of discussions, email exchanges, interviewing a bunch of people who had worked with him, I came to believe that Adam Rifkin is one of the most inspiring givers I've ever met. Now, I should say by way of background, Adam is a computer science PhD dropout from Caltech. He's built supercomputer applications for NASA. He owns a couple of patents. He's so shy and introverted that for a long time he was afraid to talk to strangers. He's also spent a good chunk of his life trying to rearrange the letters in Adam Rifkin to find the perfect anagram, hoping that if he could scramble his name's letters enough that he could actually capture something that would represent his identity. The man has also actually counted the number of hours he's wasted in his life, typing 2 spaces after each period instead of 1. It's a little bit of a scary analysis for those who are tempted to do it. And he's just a strange guy. He's really obsessed with Star Trek, and I'm very, very curious about how does this guy turn out to become a better networker than Michael Dell, Jeff Weiner, and every other of the 90 million people on LinkedIn. And so when I started talking to Adam, he actually answered the question with a song. I said, Adam, how did you build your network? And he said, in the end, only kindness matters. He's saying it better than I did. But I was sort of caught off guard that Jewel would be his source of inspiration. But he said, look, I've really built connections with all these people just by trying to, in small ways, improve the lives of the people that I interact with. And I thought that was a fascinating statement, and I wanted to learn more. So I said, let's go a little bit deeper. And Adam said, well, what you have to know is the distinction between strong and weak ties. So some of you are familiar with Mark Granovetter's research. What Granovetter showed was most people, when they need help, when they're looking for a job or perhaps trying to innovate or get some advice, they will go to the strong ties, the people they really trust. And that turns out to be the opposite of what works best. Your strong ties tend to have redundant information and redundant connections. They know the same things and the same people that you do for the most part. And Granovetter found people are about twice as likely to get a new job, for example, by reaching out to their weak ties, their acquaintances, who traveled in different circles and had different knowledge and different networks. So Adam said, you've got to understand that distinction. And I said, okay, well, how does that play out in your life? He said, it doesn't. I'm too shy to reach out to my weak ties. And even if I did, I'd really want to help them, and then I'd accidentally turn them into a strong tie, and then they'd be useless to me. So he said, I found a way to get the best of both worlds. Not only the novel information that weak ties bring, but also the trust, the familiarity, the comfort of a strong tie. How did he do it? Well, Adam's known as the giant panda of computer programming in some corners of Silicon Valley. And that's in part because in the early 1990s, he was one of the first people to recognize the social potential of the Internet. To say, wait a minute, the Internet is actually a tool for building community and connection between people, not just sharing information. So he decided he was going to come out of the shell and try to become a little more comfortable with social interaction. So he posted all of his personal information on the web for anyone to access publicly, including his home phone number and his address and anything else you could want to learn about him. He soon came to regret that decision. So 1993, he's a fan of music. He goes to see lots of small-town bands performing locally. He wants to help them succeed. And out of the kindness of his heart, he starts to build them fan pages, hoping that other people on the Internet will discover them, and that then these bands can build a following and achieve some success. So most of the bands that he builds these fan pages for don't get much attention, but one of them just takes off. In the first month, they have about 100,000 visitors. Within 6 months, they have over 1 million visitors, which is amazing because I didn't even know there were 1 million people on the Internet in 1993. But when you look at the amazing fan base that Adam was able to attract really, really quickly, it helped this band take off, and they just skyrocketed into stardom. So by 1994, they're world famous, and the manager calls Adam Rifkin up, and they say, look, this website helped to make our band successful, and we love it so much, and you have so many fans there, that we actually want to buy it from you and make it our official band website. And Adam says, no, I'm not willing to sell it to you. I'm going to give it to you for free, and just hands it over to them. So this was a really nice moment for Adam. I think it was one of his earlier sort of giving moments. But unfortunately, something bad happened along the way. So shortly before this band called him up, he got a really, really nasty message. It was one of these sort of all capital letters emails, and it said, you're advertising this stupid band as a punk rock band. And in reality, this band is really top 40, there's sort of a little bit of alternative maybe. And you are doing a gross injustice, a grave disservice to all of the real punk rock bands out there. And Adam didn't know how to respond, but I should tell you all that the so-called punk rock band that Adam helped to make famous, you might have heard of, they're called Green Day. So Adam's reading his email, trying to figure out what to do, because he's got this really nasty message. It came from this guy, Graham Spencer, punk rock fan with a green mohawk. And Adam's, picturing this guy and thinking, oh my God, why did I put my address and my home phone number on the Internet? So partially out of fear, partially out of the desire to help, he writes back and he says, Dear Graham, I'm so sorry, I'm not familiar with real punk rock. If you can send me some tapes, I'd love to listen to them and learn a little bit about it. So Graham ends up sending him some tapes. Adam listens. He says, they're not my cup of tea. But he ends up saying, you know what, I want to help these bands out, and I also want to make sure that Graham Spencer doesn't violently attack me. So he builds fan pages for these punk rock bands, and he links them to the Green Day page, so that if you've done an Alta Vista search and you're looking for punk rock, you accidentally get to Green Day, you can actually discover these other bands. And that is the end of Adam Rifkin's interaction with Graham Spencer. Graham never hunts him down, never violently attacks him. And 5 years go by. 5 years later, Adam decides to quit his PhD program at Caltech. He wants to move up to Northern California. And he doesn't know anybody there. And he knows he needs to reach out to somebody for help because he wants to start a company to organize big data. And he scrolls through his email archives, and he digs up this old trail with Graham Spencer 5 years earlier. And he remembers that he thinks that Graham lived in Northern California. So he throws the Hail Mary pass. And he basically just responds to the email, "Dear Graham, I don't know if your email address is even active 5 years later. You may not remember me, but I'm that guy who built the punk rock pages linked to my Green Day page. I'm moving up to Northern California. Would you be willing to meet up and chat with me a little bit? I'm trying to start a company, and I don't really know anybody." A couple days later, Graham replies, says, "Yep, I'm here. I remember you, and I'd be happy to meet up for coffee." A few weeks later, they sit down. And Adam is a little surprised because Graham Spencer does not exactly have a green mohawk. In fact, he turns out to be a computer programmer by training. And they have about a 2-hour conversation. Adam swears to this day that Graham said about 8 words because he was even more quiet and introverted than Adam was. And at the end of the conversation, Graham says, "You know what, I would actually love to help you out. This sounds like a cool project. Let me see if I can make some introductions." In the next couple of weeks, Graham has opened the door for Adam Rifkin to pitch his startup idea to 18 different venture capitalists, one of whom funds his startup idea for $50 million. And how in the world did that happen? Well, in the 5 years since they had last interacted, Graham Spencer had gone from a college student studying computer science to the founder of a little company called Excite, which he had just sold the previous year to the at-home network for $6.7 billion. So that was a connection that really paid off. And I asked Adam after he told me this story, I said, "So, how do you explain, that amazing story?" And he said, "Well, givers get lucky. How could I possibly know that, this college student that I helped in this small way was going to become a very influential and well-connected guy in the world that I was actually working in?" I thought about it for a little while, and I began to believe that it wasn't actually luck per se. So Adam's carrying around this state of pronoia, right? He thinks that people like Graham Spencer are plotting his well-being. But I believe, and there's a lot of data now to back this up, that if you are a giver like Adam Rifkin, this is not, in fact, a delusion. It's reality. There are other people plotting your well-being and saying nice things about you behind your back. And those people primarily are matchers. So if you are a matcher, you believe in a just world. And that means you think what goes around should come around. That means you can't stand to see takers get away with exploiting others. And you will often, when you see a successful taker, try to punish that person. Rob Willer at Stanford actually shows that matchers and givers as well tend to go around gossiping when they encounter a taker to try to spread negative reputational information and protect other people against that person. So matchers not only try to take takers down, they also can't stand to see givers act generously without being rewarded. And so if you are a matcher, you are often on a mission to make sure that givers succeed so that, again, everything is fair and just. And so matchers actually go around literally plotting the well-being of people like Adam Rifkin. And I think that what Adam calls luck is actually this very predictable pattern reaction, which is if you have built all this goodwill by contributing generously to other people's lives, they will often go around trying to make you more successful. And that's, of course, a matcher's best way to even the score. So, I don't know that Graham Spencer is a giver. He's probably, by most accounts, more of a matcher. But matchers tend to respond in kind. So if most people are matchers and you are a giver, that means there are a lot of matchers working on your behalf. So I think one takeaway, and there's evidence again behind this, is givers to succeed need matchers in their networks to protect them against takers and to actually help open doors and create opportunities for them. A couple other takeaways, though, that I would draw from this story, each of which has some really cool research behind it. So one of them is, if you look at what Graham Spencer was to Adam Rifkin, he wasn't a strong tie or a weak tie. He was a third kind of tie that researchers call a dormant tie. They had a meaningful history. They had an exchange that was more than just what acquaintances would do. And Adam spent a lot of hours helping Graham in these punk rock bands. But they'd been out of contact for a while. Typically, a dormant tie is somebody that you used to have a meaningful connection with, but you've been out of touch for at least 3 years. Could be longer, 5, 7, 10 years. And research by Daniel Levin and his colleagues actually shows if you need advice or ideas, if you reach out to a dormant tie, you get more valuable information than if you reach out to a current tie. Why? Well, it turns out that you get the novelty of a weak tie because the dormant ties in the 3, 5, 7 years since you last spoke have been meeting new people and learning new things. And so they give you less redundant information than your strong ties. But they also bring you the benefit of the strong tie, which is you have the shared perspective, you have some comfort, you have some trust, or at least a residue of trust built up. And so it's much easier to reconnect and reach out for help when you have a dormant tie than just a pure acquaintance. So there's a lot of research that shows the benefits of reconnecting with dormant ties. My analysis of this is that this is a huge advantage for givers. If you're a taker, it's really hard to reconnect and reactivate dormant ties because most of those bridges have been burned. If you've been a matcher, typically you've already been really careful to even the score, and you may feel like you're going into some kind of debt if you actually reconnect. Whereas givers have this reservoir of goodwill in their networks that's just waiting to be activated. Now, that brings me to the second point, which is a lot of givers make the mistake of being unwilling to ask for help. They like to be on the contributing end of exchanges. They worry about perhaps being takers if they receive help. And I think it's really important to make a distinction between taking and receiving. Taking is basically receiving something from someone else and being unwilling to reciprocate or pay it forward. Receiving is being grateful or appreciative of what someone else contributes to you. And perhaps then, when the time is right, being willing to help that person or someone else in a similar way. So one of the things I find is, in order for givers to succeed, they have to be willing in critical situations to be in the receiving situation, not just the giving situation. And help seeking is a big driver of that. There's evidence that if you look at all helping this exchange in organizations, somewhere between 75 and 90% of all help is initiated with a request. And so if givers don't seek help, these dormant ties never have the opportunity to know what they need and try to reciprocate. Two other ideas I would take away from Adam Rifkin's story. One is Adam believes in an idea that he calls the 5-minute favor. So he generally finds that it's risky to go out of his way to spend hours and hours and hours helping everyone he meets. And there are real limits to the amount of people he can help if he does that. And I think that's one way that givers often sink to the bottom. Rather, what he does is he says, look, I'm going to try to find high benefit to others, but low cost to me ways of contributing. He loves making introductions to two people who could benefit from knowing each other. Spending just 5 minutes hearing an entrepreneur pitch an idea and then giving some really, really candid feedback. And these kinds of sort of small random acts of kindness, I think, are what really allow him to sustain all of the helping and giving that he does. The final thing that I would say about Adam Rifkin's story, and this is another key for successful givers, is Adam is actually pretty bold about asking people for things, but he's rarely asking for himself, like you saw in the Graham Spencer story. Rather, what he does is after he helps you, he will then ask you to pay it forward and help someone else. And what he's trying to do is make that the norm, right, that everybody gives and helps each other out. And I think what's really powerful about that then is it makes it a lot safer to be a giver. Because if you have people who are willing to be fellow givers in your network or your group or your organization, you don't have to worry about putting your guard up against takers. And lo and behold, what you get is a bunch of givers who are willing to expand the pie in a way that ideally benefits everyone. So I think those are a couple lessons about what successful givers do. And I would just say, there are lots of different ways that one could go about being a giver. So I looked at some research on this, and I combined it with what I learned from Adam. And I've identified at least 6 different ways, maybe 7 actually, if you were to break this up, of being a giver in one's daily life. So I would think about helping, solving a direct need. If you borrow some of Malcolm Gladwell's ideas, some people love being givers by being a connector who's always introducing people, or being a maven who's sharing knowledge or up-to-date information. There are some people who love to give by organizing events, or by really giving other people credit and recognizing their accomplishments, maybe even writing a letter to their boss. And then, of course, volunteering and mentoring, I think, are 2 really common forms of giving. So if you look at, Adam Rifkin does a lot of these, as do many successful givers. And if you look at the total sort of experience of Adam Rifkin, what you find is if you take those anagrams of his own name, he's come up with a lot of bad anagrams. And one day he hit on the perfect one, which is if you rearrange the letters in Adam Rifkin, they actually spell I find karma, which I thought was a very touching conclusion to his story. And I think, yeah, there is a lot of karma in giving, but it's actually not as magical as it often sounds, right? It's driven by act like matchers plotting the well-being of givers. It's driven by reconnecting with dormant ties who are willing to help out in critical times of need. It's driven by encouraging other people to act like givers and doing so in a way that's efficient and productive for everyone in a group or network. So that was a little bit of what I wanted to talk about. Happy to open it up for questions and dialogue whenever you're ready. David, you want to turn it over to you?
Yeah, great, Adam. Thank you. It's funny. Typically what we do is if you and I dialogue during a Q&A, and I do that with the presenters, and so I try to keep quiet when you're presenting because we want to fill it, really get it out there. But I didn't expect that you were going to be that funny, so I was trying not to laugh out loud every once in a while. I'm sure I broke the silence, but I do have to tell you, though, I didn't say this in the introduction. I got a call from my mom who just turned 80 a month ago, and she said, "Did you see the boy you're going to be interviewing on Thursday? He's in the New York Times." So you impressed my mom with your profile.
Hey, that was my goal in life.
Right, there you go. See, that was a gift for her. So let's do some questions. There are some questions have already been submitted. Let me just say this again to all the members out there. If you have a question, this is a good time. You can submit it in the question box on the control panel and send those in. If you can, try to keep them short. They're easier for me to communicate. And as well, we always love to know where you're calling from around the world. Let us know your name and where you're from. So let's dive in. Adam, first one comes in from Alan J. Yoon Lee, and his question is around cultural differences. He poses it this way: would there be a cultural difference for the giver's pattern and benefits? For example, in collectivist cultures, givers might be in a better position or vice versa. That's his question. What do you think?
Really interesting question. So I think the best research I've read on this is Alan Fisk's work on relational models. And if you look at his book or his articles on the elementary forms of social life, he does show sort of both cultural differences and cultural universals. So on one hand, giving, taking, and matching styles do exist in every culture around the world, and people mix and match these models across their different interactions. But cultures differ in how much emphasis they place on these styles, and also perhaps where they use them. So Fisk did these really cool studies of the African Maasai, and what he was able to show is they were typically operating like givers when it comes to land, where if you want to move into their village, they will just give you land and expect nothing from you. They're more likely to be takers, on the other hand, if you go to the marketplace, where everybody's haggling for the very best price. And they tended to be matchers when it came to sharing food, where everybody was expected to bring equal proportions. And I think in general, actually, collectivist cultures tend to be more matching cultures than they are giving cultures. If you look at Fisk's data, what you see is collectivism is all about, sort of pounding the spoke that sticks out and making sure that everybody's even. And so I think that at minimum, there's better protection against takers in collectivistic than individualistic cultures. But I think that one of the things that I think is really critical about sort of what motivates givers is that it's typically intrinsically rather than extrinsically driven. And many collectivistic cultures are sort of guided by a sense of duty or obligation to contribute to others. And I think if you look at the data on this, some of my own research as well as Joachim Gebauer and colleagues have shown that the giving is actually less sustainable when it's driven by more introjected or more external motivations as opposed to the more self-determined, intrinsic, identified, or integrated.
Great. Wow. Excellent. Here's a question maybe somewhat related. There are a few people who have asked a question similar to this. I'll phrase it as Adam Hancock has phrased it. How do you help people change from takers to givers?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I think that it's not necessarily easy. So the best study that I've seen on this is Yuri Nisi and his colleagues, who show that if you get a taker to engage in high-cost acts of giving and helping, that will often evoke cognitive dissonance. So the taker goes through this experience, let's say, for example, trying to help you get a job, and then says, gosh, why did I spend all this time and energy doing it? Why did I stick my neck out there, to sort of open up my network and put myself on the line? And it must be because I really care about this person. And you do that a couple times, and you start to think, well, it's not just this person. I actually really care about being helpful. And there becomes this sort of then attitude and value shift that follows from behavior change. I think that would be one route. Yeah, I think a second route is to take a page out of Elliot Aronson's work on self-persuasion. This is some research I've done with Sharon Ariely and Lilach Sagiv, where we actually say, look, everybody values giving somewhere. So if you look at friends and family members, Margaret Clark and her colleagues have shown that in your closest relationships, even if you're a taker at work, you tend to be more of a giver at home. So it'd be really odd if your spouse asked you for help and you were like, well, what have you done for me lately? And same goes for close friendships, right? So the trick is to get people to reflect on those values and then sort of import them over to a different domain. So the way that Sharon and Lilach and I studied this is we actually have you reflect on times that you have been really helpful and gone out of your way to contribute to others or engage in a benevolent act. And we give you a little bit of evidence about how common this is, and we have you fill out a checklist of little things you've done to benefit other people, like making an introduction, for example. And then we ask you to write a persuasive essay about why it's important to help others and why, in fact, other people should be doing more giving. And that tends to cause what we find is a value and attitude shift toward placing greater importance on giving and helping. And so, one of the things I would do based on that is really engage a taker in a conversation about, gee, are there times when you've really actually enjoyed or cared about helping others? If so, why? And then allow that person, hopefully, to begin articulating that message to others. But I don't think it's easy.
No, that's excellent. That gets us started, right? So there's hope. Another question related to kind of the emotional give back, I guess, or what a giver feels. This question comes in from Greece, Dr. Sophia Protopapa, and she says, Dr. Sophia asks, why do givers give? What is the feeling they get in return for their giving?
Why do givers give? I think there are a lot of possible answers to that. I think in my view, most giving that givers do is driven by a mix of other-oriented and more self-interested motives. So, there's been this egoism-altruism debate that Bob Cialdini and Daniel Batson have raged for about 35 years. And, trying to figure out, does pure altruism exist or can it exist? And I think, most psychologists agree at this point that yes, it can, but it's a little bit like a mathematician doing an existence proof to say, yes, this is possible under rare conditions. But when I look at everyday acts of giving and helping in organizations, what I find is most of the time people do them both because they really care about benefiting this person, but also because it feels good to live in a way that's consistent with your values, or to be the kind of person who's seen by others and who's able to see oneself as as helpful and generous. And so there is a lot of evidence about the the mood and positive affect and meaning benefits of giving. You can look at Margaret Clark's work. You can look at Batson's work on empathic joy. There's new work by Jennifer Acker and her colleagues that really speaks to this point that's been covered recently in The Atlantic. And I think that oftentimes, psychologists would call it the helper's high. Economists even have a term for it. They call it the warm glow of altruism. And I think that good feelings are often a byproduct of giving and helping, but that I think if it's driven only by the desire to feel or look good, then it's probably not as effective or sustainable as it could be.
That's great. Wow. We've got Adam related to that question. Caroline Miller asked a question regarding kind of hedonic adaptation in the sense of we were talking about the helper's high. Is there anything that we know from research that says that the giver starts to get used to it, doesn't get that emotional pump that they do in the beginning, or is there a way that you or you personally or in your research has found that you're able to consciously appreciate just what's happening, so that there's really that helper's high in a sense continues, even if that's not your motivation for it, just the benefit of it. How do we make sure to somehow keep that alive?
That's a fascinating question. I think that there's a doctoral dissertation waiting to be done for anyone who's interested on what might be called the eudaimonic treadmill. Yeah. And asking, is there actually some degree of diminishing return psychologically to the meaning, that's attached to really making a difference in the lives of others, in the same way that we often see with happiness and more hedonic states? I think the answer is a qualified no. I don't have good data to speak to this. What I would say, though, is if you look at Sonia Lyubomirsky's work, for example, on random acts of kindness, and her data that chunking acts of helping together, in 1 day per week actually leads to increases in well-being, over a multi-week period, whereas doing one small act every day doesn't. I think that what Sonia is basically making the case for is you need to do enough giving to be able to really see the impact and feel like you're making a difference. And sometimes that's difficult if you sprinkle your giving, in a very dispersed way around lots of other things that you're doing. And so I think probably the most effective way to sustain that helper's high and make it feel sort of novel and meaningful is actually to pile up a lot of the giving that you do in the course of a single window or a single day or a single week at a time, perhaps, so that you can really see the cumulative effect of the contributions that you're making. And then, I think the other key, I write about this as well in Chapter 6, is to really think about varying the giving in terms of either how you contribute or who benefits from your efforts. So, if giving starts to feel a little bit repetitive, or, if it just begins to feel like something that, you've done over and over and over again in the same way, I would start thinking about who are other groups of people that you care about, or who might benefit from your knowledge or your skills or connections. And I think oftentimes fresh ways of helping them are rejuvenating.
That's great. That's awesome. Another question has come in regarding call centers. I know that you've done work with call centers, and the question comes in from Monica Howells. If you were to work, and this we could probably take an hour on just alone, this is a good question. If you were starting to work with call centers and you're really trying to inspire the call center members, there may be one or two quick things that Adam, you would suggest that where you would want to start in order to make a difference for those call center participants?
Yeah, I mean, certainly in the studies that I've done in call centers, I've been struck by the fact that it's often really difficult to see, who are you actually helping through the work that you do. Oftentimes you're dealing with really rude or angry customers, and perhaps sometimes a group of managers who also don't really appreciate the work that you do. And so what I found really powerful effects from is bringing in my case, I've studied fundraising callers and brought in scholarship students to be able to talk about how the fundraisers were able to make their scholarships possible. Here's how it changed their lives. And there's this tremendous boost in energy, in productivity, in revenue that comes from now seeing my work made a difference. There are people out there who value what I do, and now I have a heightened sense of commitment to helping them. And so instead of seeing my job, I'll take a page from action identification theory here of Valcher and Wegner. Instead of thinking about my job as making calls, I now think about it as helping people. And I think that bringing that impact through the end users front and center is really valuable. I think that beyond that, I think this is always an opportunity for job crafting. And so I would say, look, sometimes it's actually not your core work that allows you to benefit other people. I know a couple of folks on the call have heard me talk a little bit about Apple Tree Answers. This is a call center in Delaware that has an amazing program called Dream On. And what they do is they sort of run an internal Make-A-Wish process for their employees. And they allow every employee who's interested to make a dream request for something they really want. It could be a birthday party like behind the scenes at a circus for your child. Or it might be for your spouse who's in the hospital to be visited by their favorite athlete. And there's actually a dream granting committee that gets together and tries to make these things happen. And the effects have been remarkable. They had annual turnover in the range of 90% before they started the program, and afterward they dropped into the 30% range. And I think what was most powerful, if you look at a story about this, is what really changed in their culture. That as employees recognized that there were people who were willing to help them, they were more comfortable both giving and seeking help. And I think it really allowed people to sort of do less taking and more giving overall. For those of you who haven't seen this, if you go to YouTube and you type in Apple Tree Answers Dream On, there's a pretty powerful video that goes into more detail about the program.
That's great. Awesome. Well, we're going to try to pack in another question maybe to Angus Skinner from overseas. Asked a great question. He said he appreciated the answer regarding your answer regarding cultures and collectivist societies. His question was, how about the cultures of professions? For example, bankers, are they inevitably takers, and medical staff and medical and care staff, maybe they're more givers? Could you talk to what we know, and does one tend to burn out more than another based on the nature of the culture of those particular professions?
Yeah, really, really intriguing question. So this is something I just started collecting data on, and the patterns that I've discovered so far are not surprising, right? So you find more givers in, sort of really service-oriented jobs, healthcare, education, for example, and more takers in, the financial sector, as you might anticipate. I would say, though, those effects are a lot weaker than a lot of people would expect, and you do find a mix of givers, takers, and matchers in every industry and every organization. What I think is really interesting is to break it down and say, okay, who actually are you thinking about as the beneficiaries of your work, right? In some organizations, it's your customers, and others, it's your coworkers. It may be your suppliers in different places. And I think what you'll find, in some of the work that I've done with Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, for example, is there are a lot of people there who will say, look, my job is basically to help this particular group of people and create value for them. And, the question is, can I become more of a giver either by helping them more or broadening the range of people that I contribute to? And I think at the end of the day, it's complicated, right? So, is it acceptable to, to take from some and give to others, sort of a Robin Hood effect? I think there's a whole debate we could have about that, but I guess that would be my gut reaction.
That's great. So we were going to shoehorn in one last question. So, and then we're going to do something for folks who have their questions. We're going to work on getting your answers. But first, last question, just around. Relationships are built on trust, a lot of research on just how important trust is in a relationship. If you're really a massive giver, and you clearly are the Superman of giving, Adam, do you, in terms of expectations that are set for people, how does one, as a giver, do we have any data or just qualitative review of how does a giver set expectations so that they're not thinking they can do all these things, and then ultimately at the end of the day they can't get it done, and leaving then people disappointed that they were not able to follow through on what was expected as that they were going to receive the benefit of a giver's help?
Ooh, that is such an important question. I wish I had a good answer to it because it's something that I wonder about a lot. But I think that, when I look at the data, and I've been trying to apply some of what I've been writing about to my own experiences, I think a lot of it really comes down to being clear about what your boundaries are. And I think that means, being clear about those boundaries to yourself and to other people. So, one of the things that I'm working on doing is actually articulating when people ask me for help. I will always try to help as many people as I can. But I'm also going to say, number one, am I the person who is uniquely suited to help with this? And I'm going to try to spend more of my time, helping on things where I can do something or I know someone that I perhaps think others can't. And if not, I may try to refer the request elsewhere. And then secondly, also to just be really clear, at least when I look at my priorities, the people that I want to give to most, number one are my family. That always comes first. Number two are my students. And number three then are my colleagues. And so, one of the things I'm trying to do is, as colleagues make, large numbers of requests, I'm going to start stopping at the point where it begins to interfere with my ability to help my family or contribute to my family and contribute to my students as much as I can. And, I think at the end of the day, what really has to happen then is setting those expectations up front so that you can be more proactive about what helping you do as opposed to just getting inundated with requests. And I heard once that if you're not careful, you will end up with people's garbage just being dumped all over you. And I think boundaries are probably the solution to that.
Oh, that's great. Well, look at that. We have, I think, a minute to wrap up. I personally would love to, as I think I represent everybody on the planet who is familiar with you, that I personally wouldn't mind just sitting here for another hour with my own questions, so I can just imagine what's happening around the world.